Hello, my name is Darla Deardorff. I am based in the United States in the state of North Carolina. I am a research fellow at Duke University and also have faculty appointments at several other universities around the world. In addition, I am founding president of the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence, as well as the executive director of the Association of International Education Administrators, AIEA, in which we work with university leaders around the world on internationalizing their institutions. And I also do quite a bit of work with organizations like the United Nations and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. So I've been researching intercultural competence for over the last decade. And I think the pandemic in particular has really brought out reasons even more as to why we need intercultural competence, and we need to intentionally address intercultural competences in education and in lots of different contexts in which we work. And this is particularly important because while we might interact daily with those who are different from us and have that experience in communication, it doesn't mean that experience eliminates the misunderstandings and the challenges that we face every day when we try to communicate with those who are different from us. And intercultural competence is actually broader than just communication, that it's really more about looking at what's necessary for us to get along together as humans on this planet. And we're not doing a very good job of that, unfortunately. There are so many divides that face our societies. There's so many examples of racism and discrimination. And if we are more intentional in addressing intercultural competence, then there's a hope that some of those divides can be bridged and misunderstandings will be mitigated, and so that there is a better opportunity for us to understand each other and therefore begin to address some of the racism and the discrimination that certain populations face within our societies. So I would say that intercultural competences is needed now more than ever. It's not something that just occurs naturally, that we must be intentional about addressing intercultural competences in all contexts and in many different generations. And I am reminded and motivated by a quote from a civil rights leader in my country, Martin Luther King Jr., when he said, "We must learn to live together as brothers, as family, or perish together as fools." And in this case, this quote really shows that this is not an option, and it's something we must learn. It doesn't just happen. And so that we must learn to live together in order to confront all of the challenges that humans face, or we'll perish together as fools. And so for me, I think there's never been a greater reason why we need to really address intercultural competences. Research I've done has resulted in one of the first research-based frameworks and definitions around intercultural competence. This resulted in identifying several key elements of intercultural competence. So let me start by saying first that the short definition of intercultural competence is communication and behavior that is both effective and appropriate in interactions across difference, whatever those differences might be. And those could be national differences, it could be ethnicity, race, religion, socioeconomic, gender, generational. That's the brief definition but there's much, much more to intercultural competences. And some of the key elements are usually in many of the definitions and in mine as well, divided into knowledge and skills and attitudes. And based on my research, the key attitudes that emerged as being absolutely essential to intercultural competence are three. One is openness, open-mindedness. Two is respect. And three is curiosity, of really wanting to learn about the other. The respect is very important in terms of how do we show and demonstrate we value each other as fellow humans, especially when we might disagree or have vast differences, that we still need to show that we value each other as fellow humans sharing this planet. And then the open-mindedness, of course, is really important in being open, kind of with this growth mindset of learning something new every day, if you will. One of the key knowledge areas is around cultural self-awareness and understanding our own cultural lens and the way in which we see the world, and understanding that that is only one way, and that there are multiple other ways of seeing the world. And so that's an important knowledge piece. One of the important skill areas is in listening. And I would say in this case, it's really about listening deeply to each other. And that oftentimes the understanding that we seek starts with listening. And so that listening piece is really, really important. And then together, and so those are some of the key knowledge, skill, and attitude areas. Together, what those kind of mean for us is then what happens inside each individual, that ideally we would become more adaptable, more flexible, that we are able to develop empathy in how we relate to others. And this is what happens inside us. And then the external outcome from my research is the model that I told you earlier about this behavior and communication that is both effective and appropriate in intercultural interactions across difference. One word about the effectiveness and appropriateness. Those are key words to understand, that oftentimes as individuals, we might think we're being effective and appropriate. And for effectiveness, yes, we know whether we've been able to meet our goals or not in the interaction. But the appropriateness can only be determined by the other person. And so that's where it becomes really challenging when we're looking at intercultural competence, and particularly for educators who are wanting to assess intercultural competence. And that's been another area of my research and work, is around assessing intercultural competence. There are over 140 different assessment tools available currently to assess intercultural competence. Most of those are looking at from the self perspective. And as I've just shared with you the definition around intercultural competence, that self perspective is really only half the picture, because the other half is the others in the interaction and how they determine whether what I am saying and doing and how I behave is appropriate or not to them in that situation. And so based on my research, even with assessment, it needs to be an assessment that is multiple method and multi-perspective. And so one tool from one individual's perspective is insufficient. It can be part of it, but it needs to be a much more robust assessment. So there's a lot within that definition and the key elements of intercultural competence. And the last thing I would mention is it's important to note that this is a lifelong process, that there's no one point at which any of us can say, okay, I'm interculturally competent, because every day we can learn more. And this is a lifelong process of learning about others and how we can improve our interactions. across difference. And so that has real implications in terms of understanding that we are all on intercultural journeys. We are at different places in those journeys. And that indeed this is a lifelong process, which means in the end, it's really more about the journey, about the process, than it is about arriving at a particular destination and in achieving intercultural competence that really can never be achieved, since we're always working toward developing our intercultural competence. So I've been working with UNESCO for quite a number of years around this concept of intercultural competence. And a few years ago, my partners at UNESCO came to me and said that the nation state, the member states, really wanted a concrete methodology for developing intercultural competence. And there were certain parameters that needed to be observed in determining a methodology for developing intercultural competence. And in particular, there were four key parameters to pay attention to. One is that it needed to be used with any group of people. Two, anywhere in the world. Three, using little to no resources. And four, that could be facilitated by anyone, really. And it didn't need to be facilitated by someone who had a particular degree or background or education in intercultural communication. And since I've been doing intercultural training for years, that was a really tough piece to work on, because a lot of what I had done and other intercultural trainers, it really doesn't fit those parameters. And in fact, a colleague and I had even put together a book with over 50 different activities. The book is called Building Cultural Competence. None of those activities would fit the parameters that UNESCO was looking for. And so we embarked on a series of interviews and focus groups around the world to try to determine what could be possible to meet these parameters that UNESCO was looking for. And in the end, what emerged is something that has been around as long as humans have been around, and that is in sharing our personal stories and experiences through circles. And circles are inspired by indigenous cultures and traditions around the world. And humans have been using circles for centuries. And so in combining the two, called story circles, we arrived at this intercultural methodology that involved sharing personal stories through smaller circles. These were, of course, adapted from indigenous traditions, and as I mentioned, it kind of inspired by them. And what emerged then was a very specific, structured protocol for using story circles, and yet a protocol that's very adaptable in many different settings around the world. And so UNESCO wanted to see, okay, does this really work with any group of people anywhere in the world? And so we then engaged in piloting story circles in all 5 UNESCO regions around the world. And so these story circles, we started first in Bangkok, Thailand, and then in Harare, Zimbabwe, in San Jose, Costa Rica, in Vienna, Austria, and in Tunis, Tunisia. And in each of those cases, yes, these worked amazingly well. And in fact, the outcomes that we saw from story circles, which take about 90 minutes to go through, far exceed the outcomes that we have seen in half to full day intercultural trainings. And we were really amazed by that and how well this works with truly any group of people, from academics to school children, and also in both formal and non-formal settings. Of the 5 pilots, only one was in a formal learning setting in a school, and that was the one in Vienna, Austria, in working with middle school children who were about 90% migrant or immigrant background in that particular school. The other 4 um, pilots that we did were in the communities, and 2 of them took place literally outside under trees, one in Zimbabwe and one in Costa Rica. So you don't even need a building to engage in this intercultural methodology. So it's been really amazing to see how well this works in lots of different settings around the world. And beyond the 5 pilots, I have been using this in lots of other contexts and settings. For example, with over 200 teachers in Beijing, China, and with groups of educators in South Africa. And so it's been used really quite widely. The story circles have indeed been used in lots of different social contexts. I already mentioned some of them, but they've also been used not only in schools, but at universities, let's say in orientations and bringing domestic and international students together. They've been used in religious contexts, in religious communities, to help bring different individuals together. They've also been used in medical schools to help better prepare and train healthcare professionals. And then to your question here, they've been used in communities specifically to bridge divides. And story circles are being used, for example, in the United States in different communities to bring particularly marginalized populations together with the dominant culture, those from the dominant culture. Here in the state of North Carolina, where I am, we are using story circles for a particular project called Bridging Divides. And we are working with Indigenous populations here in North Carolina, with African American populations, and with Latino populations, those who've really been very hard hit by the pandemic that has kind of exasperated the divides that communities face. And using story circles to support these populations and to help increase the understandings between different groups within a local community, because oftentimes there's not a lot of meaningful interaction that needs to happen between the different groups in a local community. One other example I would share with you is that in the United States, there's a national association that has been developing what they call truth, racial healing, and transformation centers across the United States, TRHT centers for short. And these TRHT centers also use a form of circles called racial healing circles. And I've been working, there's a Duke University has one of these TRHT centers, and I have been working with this center in their racial healing circles, but then also they have come to see the value of using the UNESCO story circles as a way to really begin a foundation for bringing people together. And I think in part because these UNESCO story circles target these key intercultural competences that I spoke about earlier, in particular the listening and how important listening is for intercultural competence. And not just any kind of listening, but this deeper listening. And in particular, we really talk about this as listening for understanding, which is very different than the kind of listening that humans usually do. And as humans, it's typical that we listen for response or we listen for judgment. And when we do that, we think about where's the focus really? Well, in this case, how am I going to respond to you? What do I think of what you're saying? The focus is actually more on me, really, than on even you and what you're saying. And so, for listening for understanding to occur, we really listen in a very different way when we really pay attention 100% to what the other person is saying, the words they're saying it, how they're saying, what they're trying to convey through their message. And so we kind of take ourselves out of the equation and just really focus on the person speaking. And that's been really an aha moment for many people in the UNESCO story circles, is that they get to practice this listening for understanding. And they come out of the experience saying, wow, I need to really do a lot better job of listening. I thought I did a good job, but I need to work on that more. And so these TRHT centers find that having that kind of foundation of the UNESCO story circles, of having persons practice this listening for understanding, beginning to develop this empathy, increasing their own cultural self-awareness, is really a good foundational step to then moving into the racial healing circles that they use. So it's already being used quite a bit, I would say, then in really addressing racism, discrimination, and helping persons step back and begin to see more about others, and especially being able to see themselves in others. And that's really part of the power of the UNESCO story circles, is despite those differences, as we come together in the circles, we come away with a much stronger understanding of the power of our shared humanity. So practically speaking, story circles, it does follow a structured protocol. And what that means is that there are 3 rounds. And I should start by saying that we have found that groups of 4 to 6 people work best. And so once participants are in these groups of 4 to 6 people, as diverse as possible, and so it's a good idea, if possible, to pre-assign the groups based on diversity, including gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, language, religion, etc. Then once they're in their groups, it actually takes about 45 minutes to go through the protocol in the small groups, in their circles. And as I mentioned, it's 3 rounds. The first round is is more of an introductory round, and there's a specific prompt that would be used in that first round. And I'll give you an example of the one that we've used most often. And is this: that in 2 minutes or less, please say your name and 3 words or phrases that describe your background and why those words or phrases are important to you. And each person in the circle would have 2 minutes or less to talk about this. And this is where the listening for understanding is really important, because even in between the person sharing, there should be no questions, no comments, and no interruptions. When one person finishes speaking, then the next person would begin. Everyone else is really engaged in listening for understanding. And then once everyone has finished that first round, then we go into a second round. And this is really at the core of the UNESCO story circles. And the second round involves an intercultural prompt. And in the manual are examples of both prompts for the first round and for the second round. And in the second round, the participants in the circle have 3 minutes or less to respond to one of these intercultural prompts. The one that we have used most often is to say that in 3 minutes or less, please tell about a specific memorable experience you've had with someone who is different from you, whatever those differences may be, and what you've learned about yourself and about others through that interaction. And then again, everyone goes around and shares 3 minutes or less, no interruptions, no comments or questions. And that part can be really difficult for some. It's hard for me because I'm a person who likes to say, oh, and then what happened? Oh, and can you tell me more about? And I can't do that when I'm listening for understanding. I just need to listen. Third round is what we say a lightning round. It goes really fast. And we go back to the first person who shared the second story, the story in the second round. And all the other persons in the circle will simply tell that person, the most memorable part of your story for me was this. That's it. Each person just goes around and just completes that sentence quickly. And then you go to the second person who shared their story, and the same thing. Everyone goes around and says, the most memorable part of your story for me was this. And this is called a flashback round. And the flashback round, we have seen time and time again, is incredibly impactful. And in fact, in some cases, we've had individuals say it's the first time in their life that they have ever felt heard. So it can be really powerful to be able to hear one story through the eyes of others. And then after the completion of the 3 rounds, then there's an opportunity and time for the group to then engage more in conversation. They can talk about the stories. That's when they can ask more questions. Oh, I love the story you told. Could you say more about? Or to say, oh, the part of your story was so memorable for me because I had a similar experience too, or whatever it might be. But that's where they can really engage more together in conversation around the stories they heard. That's also the opportunity for them to talk about what surprised them, what themes did they hear emerge from the stories, kind of do a bit of reflection around the stories they heard. And then that kind of ends their time together in the circle. That whole process I just described takes about 45 minutes. Again, because it's so structured, and it's really important to follow that protocol. And then we come back together as a whole group, and the facilitator then guides the group in talking about the experience in general and the lessons learned. That's not the time to talk about the specific stories told, because that's an important part, is that confidentiality means that those stories stay with the groups themselves, but the lessons learned can be shared out with everyone else. Circles are used in many other places in society. There are other kinds of circles. There are restorative justice circles, peace building circles. There are talking circles used in schools, but those have different purposes. So it's really important that participants understand that the purpose of UNESCO story circles is specifically to practice intercultural competences, such as listening for understanding. So that part needs to be in the beginning, that everyone understands the purpose, the goals, and then to go over guidelines. And guidelines, as I mentioned, include maintaining confidentiality when you're in the groups and not sharing out the stories. So going through all of this kind of piece in the beginning, making sure everyone understands the protocols and so on, and then putting them into the groups, and then debriefing as a whole group afterwards. Ideally, you would need about 90 minutes at least. When we use this with UNESCO and we do train the trainers, we actually take up 3 hours. So it can really vary in terms of how much time is allotted, but at least 90 minutes is ideal. And more is good too. In the manual, there are some supplementary materials such as action plans. And so after someone goes through the story circles, then the facilitator could guide them in completing action plans as to what they will do differently in their interactions moving forward with those who are different from them. And if the group will be coming back together, then the facilitator or others could really work on accountability for the action plans and saying what's the progress you're making on your action plan. There are some groups that meet regularly that use story circles regularly, using different prompts and perhaps putting participants in different configurations of groups. So there are many different possibilities beyond just a one-time experience. Although, back to your other question too, in terms of context, these have been used at conferences. For example, Story Circles was a centerpiece of a whole day youth peace conference in Cairo, Egypt. Um, that's where the adaptable piece comes in, is that I gave you examples of prompts, but there are many others. And so the facilitators and organizers can look through the manual and decide which prompts will work best for the groups that we're working with. And so that's the adaptable piece. And if they don't see any of the prompts provided in the manual that would work, there's a page in the manual that talks about criteria for developing your own intercultural prompt. So you can develop your own, but it's really important that these are intercultural prompts. Again, back to the purpose of practicing intercultural competencies. In the manual, it does talk about the use of a talking piece, which is an object that is passed around from participant to participant, and only the person having that talking piece can speak. And it's not talking piece is not something that I can reach across the circle to give to somebody. It has to literally pass through everyone before it gets to the person who wants to speak. And as it's being passed, anyone else, as long as they have it, is welcome to say something. That the talking piece is used in many different kinds of circles. And I know some facilitators who don't even want to use story circles without using a talking piece. In the experiences we've had, even in the pilots with the UNESCO story circles, because of the very structured nature of the protocol, it's possible to have story circles without a talking piece. I would say if there's a possibility that someone would dominate a conversation and would not respect the protocol, then it would be very important, if you're in person, to use the talking piece, if there's a possibility around that. Some of the other challenges that we've tried to address through the story circles protocol, one has to do with timekeeping. And you'll see in the manual that the timekeeper role is to rotate so that no one person is the timekeeper. In some cases, if one person is the timekeeper, that person is seen as having more power than the others in the circle. And what we've tried to do when persons are in their groups of 4 to 6 people is to make it as we say a level ground as possible for everyone in the circle. Of course, we know that given cultural context and so on, there is, of course, the possibility that those in the circle would be viewed as having more power than others. But timekeeping is one where we try to say, no, that rotates. It's also very intentional to not have a facilitator in each group. Normally, circles, particularly in more indigenous traditions, would have a circle keeper, and that is a facilitator. But in this UNESCO story circles, it was very intentional not to have a facilitator in each circle. So there's someone who talks about the process, the guidelines, and so on, gets them into the groups, but then the groups are kind of self-monitoring, if you will. And so if it's a more contentious situation and there are possibilities of conflict or so on, first of all, it might be better to consider a different kind of circle, as in maybe conflict resolution, or restorative justice kind of circle, not the UNESCO story circles, to make sure that the purpose fits the situation and context. But if there are any doubts about how the groups will be able to self-monitor and manage, then potentially there could be a facilitator in each group, but we have not. I will say one of the challenges we have found, as I was just alluding to, is that power is already ascribed to particular individuals based on the cultural context. And when we were using this in an educational setting at the universities, I'm thinking both in the United States and in China, when we did this, there was discussion about whether the professors should be in the same group with the students. And you can see now where there might be a kind of a power imbalance. And in the end, it was decided it might be better to have the professors be in their own groups with other professors, and then have the students be in their own group with students. Because otherwise, in China, for example, some of the students said that they would feel like they were performing for their professors, and that's not the point of this story circles. It's not about a performance. It's not about storytelling per se. It's about sharing one's own personal experience. It's important to think through each context and what would make the most sense in each context. With UNESCO, we've been doing quite a few train the trainers. And what we find is for someone to facilitate story circles, it's really important to have been a participant first. And so what we do is in the train the trainers is really to run a story circle experience first. And then afterwards, have them kind of step back out of their role as participant, think about what it would mean to facilitate, and then ask questions around facilitation of story circles. But the facilitator role is really more in setting up the experience for others. And it can really be any number of people. I mean, minimally 4 people are good. We don't like to do this with much less than 4. But as I've mentioned, we've done this with up to several hundred people. I would say one of the lessons learned is how story circles is promoted, and the words that are used make a big difference. We learned this the hard way in the first pilot in Thailand, when it was kind of promoted as an intercultural training. And after participants went through story circles, some of them said, "Okay, so when's the training going to start?" And I'm like, "Oh, but you just went through that." And so we've learned to not use the word training. And if you notice, I was using the word experience, the story circle experience. And it's really important to invite participants into the experience. And they should be there because they want to be there. It should not be something that is mandatory. It should not be something that is forced. That it should be an invitation to experience story circles. During the pandemic, UNESCO has had to pivot, like everyone else, to seeing how can this be done virtually. And I'm really pleased to say that yes, story circles can be done virtually. And in fact, through UNESCO, we have been using story circles to train. I use it here, but not in the invitation, to train United Nations staff around the world. And so we've been using story circles, for example, with UN staff in Brazil and Cameroon. We've also been working with UNHCR staff, those who work with refugees, and around the world. And it's been amazing how well story circles really does work virtually. Of course, the ideal is in person, literally sitting in a circle in groups of 4 to 6. But when that's not possible during a pandemic, the virtual story circles has opened up other possibilities, with persons being able to participate that may not have been able to do so if it had been in person. We have learned, though, some lessons from virtual story circles. One is that it's really important to let people know in advance that they need to ideally have their cameras on if the bandwidth permits, and that they need to commit to being there for the entire time and for coming on time and staying for the entire time. Because if someone comes late, and story circles have already started and persons are already in their groups, we cannot put people into groups after they've already started. And it's also really important for persons to stay during the entire time so that they are able to have the full experience, including the debriefing from it. So messaging that in the beginning is very important. We understand that not everyone can have the cameras on because of bandwidth issues, but if possible, that is really important because we only get what's in the little box on the screen, whereas had we been in person, you could see the full body language and so on, which is even more powerful. So those are some of the lessons learned. We've also had to adapt to a circle because we know the boxes appear different ways on people's screens, and so we have to talk about making sure to go alphabetical, for example, by first name in terms of the order. And one other thing I didn't mention earlier is that it's really important about who starts, and that is also important that it's random, and it works the same way virtually as it does in person. That what we say is that the person who starts sharing their story is the person whose birthday is closest to today, either just happened or will happen soon, so that it's a very random way in which the person is designated to start. And that's important as opposed to someone just saying, okay, well, let me start. I'm going to tell my story first. No, it needs to be more random about who is the one who starts speaking, and then going in that order alphabetically from there when it's virtual. So yes, we've learned quite a bit from the virtual story circles. But what was really rewarding to hear is that one of the UN staff members in Brazil, after having gone through the story circles experience, said that it was the most amazing experience she had had during the entire time of the pandemic. So these kinds of virtual experiences can indeed still be quite powerful. And it allows persons to connect in much deeper ways than we typically do when we're looking at each other's boxes on a screen. We found it's best to assign or use groups of 5 to 6 people instead of just 4, because if there are connectivity issues or someone drops out, you still have the number needed. I would also add that all of the experiences, the pilots I mentioned, are available to read in the manual from the voices of those who participated in those pilots. UNESCO also has a website with frequently asked questions, which are also in the manual, and some tips for using this virtually, along with some other materials. And in a few months, UNESCO hopes to develop a community of practice for facilitators of story circles. And the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence is also working to support some of this work as well. So, and that website is iccglobal.org. So there are quite a few resources available to those who are interested in using story circles. UNESCO wants this story circles methodology to be used as widely as possible in many different contexts. And of course, would welcome hearing about experiences of those who do use story circles. I would welcome hearing from persons as well, and I'm available on LinkedIn and so on. So would love to connect with those who do use story circles and hear about experiences that others may have with them.